The timing is everything. For 3 years, Emmanuel Macron positioned himself as Ukraine's most vocal supporter. Every speech condemned Russian aggression. Every visit to Kiev promised unwavering support. Every EU summit saw Macron pushing for more sanctions, more weapons, more financial aid. Then last week, the European Union finalized a $90 billion loan package to Ukraine, the largest financial commitment Europe has made to any conflict since the Marshall Plan. 48 hours later, Macron gave an interview to French media where he said, "We must begin exploring diplomatic channels with Russia. The time for dialogue is approaching." The shift was stunning from maximum confrontation to diplomatic overtures in less than 2 days. But here's what the mainstream narrative isn't telling you. Macron's pivot has nothing to do with sudden diplomatic enlightenment. It's about money, specifically who's paying for that 90 billion. The answer mostly France and Germany, and both countries just realized they've been financially trapped by their own policy. What I'm about to reveal is the financial engineering behind Europe's Ukraine support. Why Macron's timing exposes the scheme and how this $90 billion loan has created the conditions for Europe to abandon Ukraine far faster than anyone anticipated. This is the story of how European solidarity with Ukraine was always contingent, and that contingency just became binding. Let me start with the $90 billion loan structure. The European Union doesn't have $90 billion sitting in accounts. The EU budget is roughly $170 billion annually total for everything. So how does the EU provide $90 billion to Ukraine? They borrow it. The European Commission will issue bonds backed by collective EU guarantees. These bonds will be purchased by financial markets. The proceeds go to Ukraine. Is supposed to repay the loans eventually, but everyone knows Ukraine can't repay. The country's economy has contracted 30% since the war began. GDP is roughly 160 billion. Debt is already approaching 100% of GDP. There is zero realistic scenario where Ukraine repays $90 billion, which means the loans will eventually be written off or restructured into grants, which means EU member states will absorb the losses. And here's the critical detail buried in the loan structure. The losses are distributed among member states based on their share of EU GDP. Germany represents roughly 25% of EU GDP, France about 17%. Combined, France and Germany will absorb approximately 42% of any losses on the Ukraine loans. That's $38 billion that will ultimately come from French and German taxpayers. Macron just realized the implications. The political calendar makes this worse. France faces legislative elections in 2027. Macron's party is already struggling. His approval ratings are among the lowest of his presidency. Marine Le Pen's far-right national rally is leading in polls. Their central message, Macron is spending French money on foreign wars, while French citizens struggle. Every billion euros that goes to Ukraine and isn't repaid becomes a campaign issue. Macron gave billions to Ukraine while French hospitals close. Macron chose Kiev over French workers. Macron's foreign adventures bankrupted France. The political attack writes itself. Germany faces similar pressures. The AfD far-right nationalists are gaining in polls by attacking government spending on Ukraine. Both Macron and Scholz, German chancellor, are facing political doom if the Ukraine spending continues indefinitely without visible results. The $90 billion loan crystallized this problem. It made the long-term financial commitment explicit and unavoidable. Before Ukraine aid could be portrayed as temporary, just until Russia is defeated, just until Ukraine stabilizes, the endpoint was vague but theoretically finite. The $90 billion loan has a 30-year repayment schedule. This isn't temporary, this is generational commitment. French and German voters are starting to ask for what exactly. The military situation in Ukraine makes these questions more acute. Ukraine's 2024 counteroffensive failed to achieve breakthrough. Russian defensive lines held. Territorial gains were minimal and costly. The war has settled into a grinding attritional stalemate. Ukraine trades casualties for small territorial adjustments. Russia accepts casualties to hold positions. Neither side is winning in any decisive sense. Western weapons, tanks, artillery, F-16s, advanced missiles haven't produced the battlefield transformation promised. Russia adapted. The war continues. This creates a political problem for Macron and other European leaders. They sold Ukraine support to domestic audiences as temporary sacrifice that would lead to Ukrainian victory and Russian defeat. Instead, it's looking like permanent financial drain with no clear endpoint. Public support for Ukraine aid is declining across Europe. Polls show majorities in multiple countries now favor negotiated settlement over continued military support. The $90 billion loan commits Europe to decades of financial support, while public support erodes. Macron is reading the political weather and he's panicking. The strategic trap is elegant in its simplicity. By committing $90 billion, Europe has maximized its financial exposure precisely when the pathway to Ukrainian victory looks most uncertain. If the war continues for years, Europe pays billions annually with no resolution. If Ukraine ultimately loses or accepts territorial concessions, Europe paid $90 billion for defeat or partial defeat. If negotiations happen, Europe will be pressured to provide reconstruction funds on top of the military support already given. Every scenario involves massive European costs with unclear benefits. Macron has realized Europe designed its own trap, and he's looking for the exit. The Putin outreach reveals Macron's calculation. By positioning France as willing to engage diplomatically with Russia, Macron creates political cover for eventual settlement. When negotiations eventually happen, and they will, Macron can claim French diplomatic leadership produced the peace. This transforms the narrative from "we spent 90 billion and lost to French diplomacy, ended the war." It's image management. Macron is preparing the political ground for accepting outcomes that were unacceptable months ago. The timing immediately after the $90 billion loan was finalized reveals that the loan itself triggered this calculation. Once the financial exposure became real and unavoidable, the political calculus changed. Let me show you the backroom European discussions that preceded Macron's statement. European finance ministers have been conducting scenario analysis on the Ukraine loans. These analyses are classified, but elements have leaked. Scenario 1, Ukraine wins, probability assessed, 15% EU exposure, $9 billion Ukraine can't repay even if they win. Political benefit high. Scenario 2, frozen conflict probability assessed. 60% EU exposure, 90 billion initial plus 10-20 billion annually for indefinite period political benefit. Non-perpetual drain. Scenario 3, negotiated settlement with territorial concessions. Probability assessed 20% EU exposure, 90 billion plus 50-100 billion reconstruction. Political benefit negative spent, huge sums for defeat. Scenario 4, Ukrainian collapse probability assessed 5% EU exposure, total loss of 90 billion political benefit catastrophic. The scenarios all lead to the same conclusion. Continued conflict is most likely, most expensive, and provides no political benefit. Finance ministers are advising political leaders, cut your losses. Negotiate now before exposure increases further. Macron listened. The American dimension makes this more complicated. Trump's return to U.S. presidency in January 2025 changed everything. Trump has made clear he wants negotiated settlement to Ukraine conflict. He's criticized continued U.S. aid. He suggested Europeans should pay more if they care so much. This leaves Europe in an impossible position if America reduces support. Ukraine's military position deteriorates rapidly. European support alone can't sustain Ukrainian war effort at current levels. But if Europe tries to compensate for reduced American support, the financial burden becomes unbearable. Macron is seeing the writing on the wall. Trump will push settlement. Europe will be left holding the financial bag. Better to negotiate now while claiming diplomatic initiative than be forced to negotiate later after spending even more with nothing to show for it. The Russian perspective is crucial. Putin has been waiting for exactly this moment, waiting for European financial fatigue, waiting for political pressures to overwhelm solidarity. Russia's strategy from the beginning has been attritional, outlast Western attention span, and financial commitment. The $90 billion loan initially looked like European resolve. Putin likely saw it differently. European desperation. You don't commit $90 billion unless you're trying to force a conclusion. And if you're trying to force a conclusion, you're acknowledging the current trajectory is unsustainable. Macron's diplomatic overture confirms Putin's red. Europe is cracking. Russia's negotiating position strengthens every day. Europe stays committed financially, but lacks military pathway to Ukrainian victory. Putin can wait. Time is on Russia's side now, is the Ukrainian perspective is darkest. Ukraine depended on unconditional European support. Zelensky built his strategy on assumption that Western aid would continue as long as necessary. The $90 billion loan initially seemed like validation. Europe is committed for the long term, but Macron's pivot reveals the truth. Europe is looking for exit. Ukraine's nightmare scenario. Europe negotiates settlement over Ukraine's head, pressuring Kiev to accept terms Ukraine rejected. This has historical precedent. Great powers regularly negotiate settlements to wars involving smaller powers without prioritizing those powers' interests. Ukraine fears becoming the sacrificial pawn in European Russian repromotron's timing suggests this fear is justified. Let me show you the domestic French politics driving this. Macron faces the following political pressures. Le Pen's national rally leading in polls attacking Ukraine, spending promising to prioritize French interests. Economic stagnation. French growth is anemic. Public services underfunded. Infrastructure aging. Ukraine spending is politically vulnerable. Energy costs. French households and businesses still suffering from high energy prices stemming from Russia sanctions. Public questioning why they're suffering for Ukraine. Migration fatigue. France absorbed significant Ukrainian refugees. Public support for refugees declining as crisis extends. War weariness. 3 years of war. No end visible. Public wants resolution, not indefinite commitment. Every one of these pressures pushes Macron toward settlement. The $90 billion loan made the cost explicit and unavoidable, triggering political calculation. Better to negotiate now and claim diplomatic success than continue spending and face electoral disaster. Germany faces identical pressures with additional complications. German industry is collapsing. Energy-intensive manufacturing has become uncompetitive, with energy costs 3 to 4x higher than US and China. The Russia sanctions, particularly energy sanctions, are a major cause of German industrial decline. German business leaders are privately pressuring government to normalize relations with Russia to restore energy supplies at reasonable prices. The OFT has made anti-Ukraine spending and Russia sanctions opposition central to their platform. They're gaining in polls across Germany. Scholz's coalition is collapsing under economic and political pressure. Germany cannot sustain $90 billion Ukraine commitment while German industry dies and far-right gains political ground. Scholz needs settlement as badly as Macron does. Both are looking for diplomatic exit that allows them to claim success rather than admit failure. The EU institutional response has been desperate damage control. European Commission officials are emphasizing that the $90 billion is loans, not grants, and will be repaid. Nobody believes this. The loans are grants disguised as loans for accounting purposes, but the fiction serves a purpose. It allows EU officials to pretend the commitment is temporary and recoverable. This fiction breaks down if Macron publicly pursues settlement that acknowledges Ukraine can't repay. The EU is caught between political reality, needs settlement, and institutional fiction. Loans will be repaid. This contradiction will force reckoning. Either settlement happens and loans are written off, institutional crisis, or commitment continues indefinitely, political crisis. Both outcomes are disasters for European integration. The NATO dimension adds another layer. NATO has provided military support to Ukraine without direct involvement. We support Ukraine but won't fight Russia directly. This position has been politically sustainable because it limits risk while showing solidarity. But if major NATO members, France, Germany, start negotiating with Russia, it undermines NATO unity and credibility. Eastern European NATO members, Poland, Baltics, Romania, are watching with alarm. They see Macron's pivot as betrayal. They depend on NATO commitment to deter Russian aggression against them. If France and Germany will negotiate with Russia over Ukraine, will they defend Poland, the Baltic states? The security architecture of Europe is being questioned. Macron's move may save him politically in France, but it could break NATO. Let me be specific about the likely settlement terms. If negotiations happen, Russia will demand territorial recognition. Ukraine recognizes Russian control over Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, and currently occupied territories, roughly 20% of Ukrainian territory. Neutrality guarantee. Ukraine agrees to permanent neutrality. No NATO membership limits on military capacity. Sanctions relief phased removal of Western sanctions on Russia as settlement is implemented. Reconstruction funding, European and international funding for rebuilding benefiting Russian companies with contracts. Ukraine will resist these terms. Zelensky has said territorial concessions are unacceptable, but if Europe pushes settlement, Ukraine has limited options. Without European financial and military support, Ukraine can't continue fighting. Macron is preparing to pressure Ukraine to accept what Ukraine considers capitulation. This is why the timing matters. Macron is setting the stage for imposing settlement on Ukraine, not negotiating settlement with Ukraine. The historical parallel is ominous. Munich, 1938. European powers negotiated settlement with Hitler, forcing Czechoslovakia to accept territorial concessions to Germany. The settlement was portrayed as preserving peace. It instead emboldened aggression and made wider war more likely. Ukraine fears becoming the Czechoslovakia of the 21st century, sacrificed by exhausted powers pursuing peace at any cost. The parallel isn't perfect, but the dynamics are similar. Larger powers negotiating over the interests of a smaller power unable to resist. History hasn't been kind to such settlements. For Ukrainian citizens, this is catastrophic. They've suffered 3 years of war, hundreds of thousands dead, cities destroyed, millions displaced, economy devastated, all with the promise that Western support would continue until victory. Now Western support is being withdrawn, not because Ukraine is winning, but because Europe is tired of paying. The psychological and moral betrayal will define Ukrainian attitudes toward Europe for generations. If settlement is imposed, Ukraine will see it as betrayal. Europe abandoned us when it became financially inconvenient. The long-term implications for European-Ukrainian relations are severe. The Russian celebration is already beginning. Russian state media is highlighting Macron's statements as proof that Europe is cracking. That Russian strategy of outlasting Western commitment is working. Putin will portray any settlement as Russian victory. We resisted the entire West and won. This bolsters Putin's domestic position, validates his decision to invade, demonstrates Russian power and Western weakness. The geopolitical implications extend beyond Ukraine. If Russia can invade a neighbor, endure 3 years of Western sanctions and opposition, and ultimately force settlement on favorable terms, what message does that send to China regarding Taiwan, to Iran regarding regional ambitions, to any revisionist power considering changing borders by force? The message, the West's appetite for confrontation is limited by financial and political constraints. Push hard enough, long enough, and they'll negotiate. This is a catastrophic precedent. Let me show you the timeline of breakdown. January 2025, Trump takes office, announces review of Ukraine aid, signals willingness to negotiate with Russia. February 2025, European finance ministers conduct scenario analysis, conclude current trajectory unsustainable. March 2025, Macron begins floating diplomatic channels in private discussions with EU partners. April 2025, $90 billion loan finalized. Financial exposure becomes explicit. May 2025, Macron publicly calls for Putin talks. August 2025, backroom negotiations begin through intermediaries. France, Germany, Russia exploring settlement terms. September 2025, Ukraine resists pressure to negotiate on Russian terms. October 2025, Europe threatens to reduce aid unless Ukraine engages in negotiations. November 2025, Ukraine forced to negotiate under European pressure. December 2025, settlement framework announced. Ukraine accepts territorial losses in exchange for security guarantees and reconstruction funding. January 2026, implementation begins. Russia retains occupied territories. Sanctions begin lifting. This is the trajectory Macron's statement suggests. The $90 billion loan was supposed to demonstrate commitment. Instead, it accelerated the timeline to settlement by making the costs unbearable. The lesson for smaller powers is clear. Alliances with great powers are contingent. When strategic interests align and costs are manageable, great powers provide support. When costs become burdensome and strategic interest wanes, support evaporates regardless of promises made. Ukraine was promised support for as long as it takes, turned out to be as long as it's financially and politically sustainable for Europe. That window is closing. Future conflicts will reference the Ukraine case. Great power support is always conditional. Plan accordingly. The financial engineering of the $90 billion loan reveals the fundamental dishonesty of European policy. By structuring aid as loans rather than grants, Europe maintained fiction of temporariness and recoverability. This allowed politicians to sell the policy domestically. We're lending, not giving. They'll pay us back. But everyone with financial literacy knew Ukraine couldn't repay. The loans were always grants disguised as loans. The disguise served political purposes. It made massive transfers palatable to skeptical publics. Now the disguise is failing. The $90 billion is real money, real exposure, real political cost, and politicians are running from the consequences of their own policy. Macron's pivot isn't diplomatic wisdom, it's political calculation. He sees the domestic political catastrophe approaching if Ukraine's support continues indefinitely. He sees the financial burden becoming explicit and unavoidable. He sees Trump pushing settlement, making European obstinacy pointless. He's choosing political survival over Ukrainian victory. This is understandable from French domestic political perspective, but it's morally and strategically catastrophic. Morally, Europe encouraged Ukrainian resistance with promises of support, then withdrew support when it became inconvenient. Strategically, Europe demonstrated that its commitments are contingent on political and financial comfort rather than genuine strategic conviction. Both lessons weaken Europe globally. The $90 billion loan will be remembered as the turning point, not the moment Europe demonstrated resolve, the moment Europe locked in exposure that forced eventual retreat. By making the commitment explicit and financial, Europe created the conditions for domestic political backlash that will force settlement. Macron's timing, 48 hours after loan finalization, proves the causality. The loan didn't strengthen European commitment. It revealed its limits, and Russia was waiting for exactly this moment.